work was done in Alexandria by a group of about 70 Hebrew scholars, but they were Hellenized Hebrews, and they also had Greek geography as the basis of their understanding of the world. Now, these scholars, when they came to the term Yam Suf, instead of delving into it or transliterating it, they translated it as Red Sea. A Red Sea was basically the only body of water that was thought to exist adjacent to Egypt.
Since Red Sea was just a geographical interpretation by the Septuagint translation, I needed to know more about the original term. If the Hebrew Yam means sea, the question remains, what does the word Suf really mean? This would become one of the key questions of the entire investigation, because how one defines Suf can determine where one locates the crossing and what type of miracle that would require. In 2002, after my first trip to Egypt, our film crew stopped in England to conduct a series of interviews. The first was in Liverpool with Professor Alan Millard. He is one of the leading experts on the languages of the ancient Near East, and he has authored many books, including Discoveries from Bible Times. He takes the Egyptian approach. Let's talk a little bit about the word Yam Suf. Tell me, what is the definition, in your opinion, of that word?
This is a Hebrew expression, Yam Suf. The word yam is the Hebrew word for sea as a body of water, not necessarily an ocean. And suf is a Hebrew word, probably borrowed from Egyptian, meaning reeds. So the Sea of Reeds is the proper translation of that expression.
Everyone in the Egyptian approach accepts this Sea of Reeds definition for Yam Suf. This highlights the fact that there are three main terms used for the Sea of the Exodus that have developed over the centuries. Placing them on the wall of time, I could see that first came the Hebrew word Yam Suf. It shows up in the book of Exodus around 1450 BC, and it has always been called Yam Suf in Hebrew to this day. Then this location name was identified as the Red Sea in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Finally, some scholars began to translate the Hebrew term Yam Suf as Sea of Reeds. For a long time, it was thought that this Sea of Reeds was the same place as the Red Sea at the Gulf of Suez. But a significant change came with the birth of modern Egyptology, which in time would be incorporated into the Egyptian approach to the Exodus. The Egyptian group started to look at connections between Egyptian and biblical words, especially the name Yam Suf, which they connected with an Egyptian location named Patufi, which means the place of reeds in Egyptian, and was in the Nile Delta. They believed this fit well with a Sea of Reeds definition for Yam Suf, and it also lined up with the fact that the Red Sea has no reeds. A spectacular miracle at a deep sea is what I learned about growing up, and it appears to be what DeMille was demonstrating in the 10 Commandments. But if the common view today is that the Red Sea miracle was through a shallow lake that could be explained by natural causes, it makes me question what God's role would have been in this scenario. Or do I need to change my understanding of how God works in the world? I grew up in a family that for generations believed that these biblical accounts were true. Now, my own grandchildren will be asking questions about the Bible and these miracles, because the Exodus is filled with them, and I want to give them a confident response. As in my past films, I decided to take a closer look at the Bible to see what it was actually saying. Was there a pattern of evidence that fit either of the two main approaches? Looking at the text, I could see that this question is about time and distance. I identified 6 primary steps of the Exodus journey. Zooming into the wall of time during the year of the Exodus, I can place the 6 steps of the journey during a period of around 7 weeks from the time when the Israelites left Egypt, crossed the sea, and arrived at Mount Sinai. The text reveals a departure point in Egypt that the Israelites left from, a direction that was taken toward their initial goal, a desert that was crossed before they arrived at the sea, a detour that was taken off the main road that ended at a dead end, a deep sea that the Israelites passed through, and a destination for the journey, a mountain called Sinai. The first step of the pattern is the departure point in the land of Egypt. The book of Genesis records that the Israelites were a family that descended from Abraham. God had promised Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land, but they would multiply like the stars of heaven, and God would bring them out to inherit the land of Canaan. Joseph, the great-grandson of Abraham, was enslaved in Egypt before rising to power, allowing him to settle his father Jacob and their entire family into the best part of Egypt, a place called Goshen, where they multiplied greatly. In 2002, I traveled to Egypt, into the ancient land of Goshen, to meet with one of the world's foremost Egyptologists, Manfred Bietak. He had uncovered archaeological evidence of Semites underneath the city of Ramesses, mentioned in the Bible, at an older city called Avaris. But the first time I interviewed Bietak, I was startled when he told me that there was no evidence for the Israelites in Egypt. It shook my faith. Now, however, I had just learned Bietak had found new evidence related to the Israelites' departure point. I was meeting him in Jerusalem at the courtyard of the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research. I admit, I was a little bit nervous. It's so good to see you again. And you probably don't remember, but in 2002, I was sending you emails, but I think I was sending them to the Institute in Austria.
And you didn't get answers? Or?
No.
Oh
and so I came unannounced. I surprised you. At the time, you were very gracious to me. And so we did a 5-minute interview. And I said, is there any evidence of the Israelites? Is there any physical evidence of a Hebrew population that you can...
So far, not.
So far, not. And it was like I was hit by a 2x4.
But to connect this with the Proto-Israelites is a very vague affair.
Does any of that come back to you?
It's shrouded by mist.
Yeah. Eventually, I came home, and I had a crisis of faith. And that experience with you started me on a 12-year journey. And I started looking for what would be called a pattern of evidence. Here we are again, and I want to talk to you, ask you a few more questions. I wanted to ask Manfred about the region around Avaris, where the Israelites first came to live, and where their departure out of Egypt in the Exodus would eventually take place. What was his new evidence? Do you see a place where the Israelites could have lived?
A very exciting evidence comes from the region of the Wadi Tumilat. The Wadi Tumilat is a very old connection between the eastern Nile Delta and the Sinai. And I was able to prove that the western half of Wadi Tumilat was an enormous overflow lake because it was fed by a Nile branch. Mm-hmm. And it was a kind of basin, an enormous basin, 18 kilometers long, 1.8 kilometer width. And what is most interesting, and Sarah Groll pointed it out, there is a lake in one of the Ramesside texts called Geshem.
Bietak was referencing research done by the late Egyptologist Sarah Grohl and her work with Semitic toponyms. A toponym is a technical term for the name of a place, and the Israelites spoke a Semitic language, Hebrew. Sarah Grohl had identified the name Gesem in ancient Egyptian documents that she believed were connected to this area and to the Bible.
And indeed, in the Septuaginta version, Goshen is written as Gesem.
So here was another clue. The name Goshen was called Gesem in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament.
Gesem is a Semitic name tied to a big lake, and can only be this lake. And from Ramesside times, you have several more Semitic toponyms there.
So this is very interesting because what you're suggesting is that there's Semitic toponyms in Egypt.
Yes.
And why would they be there?
Why did Egyptian scribes, for heaven's sake, use Semitic toponyms for an area which belongs to Egypt?
Yeah.
It can only mean that there were people living there, the majority even, who spoke Semitic language.
In an earlier film, I was told that Avaris had over 30,000 inhabitants, and there were at least 20 other Semitic settlements in Goshen that haven't been excavated yet. This fits the Bible's claim that the Israelites had multiplied and spread throughout the land.
A new Pharaoh arises, and he doesn't remember Joseph. He enslaves the people because they're becoming too numerous and becoming a threat. So he puts them to work and embitters their lives, building store cities of Pithom and Ramses, and makes them create bricks out of mud and straw.
Here we have the name Pithom tied to a Ramesside document.
So this would be Ramesses,
Ramses,
and this is
Pithom.
Pithom. Okay.
And I think that one should not mistrust the story of the sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt. I think there is packed inside a story which may have an historical background.
After years of thinking that Bietak couldn't find evidence for the biblical account, I was surprised that he was pointing to powerful connections that confirmed the Bible's historical record for the presence of the early Israelites. The Bible states the Israelites left from the city of Ramesses. This establishes the specific departure point of the Exodus journey. However, this verse also touches on another important and controversial issue that affects every aspect of the Exodus journey, including the size of the miracles involved. The text says that the 12 sons of Jacob, who became the 12 tribes of Israel, had grown to a tremendous population of about 600,000 men. If this were true, when you add in women and children, it would likely mean a total population of over 2 million. Many find it hard to imagine this many people crossing the wilderness. This is why most in the Egyptian group favor much smaller numbers for the Israelites. It has to do with the Hebrew word Aleph. Associates for Biblical Research, ABR, have been searching for evidence matching the Bible in Israel for over 4 decades. Currently, they're excavating the location of Shiloh, where the Bible says the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant were located for centuries. Dr. Bryant Wood is the former director of ABR, and he favors the Egyptian approach.
This matter of numbers, large numbers in the Old Testament, is a very, very thorny issue. But I think clearly it has to do with our understanding of the Hebrew word Aleph, which is translated 1,000.
So if it says 650 Alephs, then that would mean 650,000.
If you take Aleph to mean 1,000.
Right.
I believe that in these early accounts that it must have another meaning. We find, in fact, that there are some places in the Old Testament where it's translated chief, it's translated clan. I like the translation unit
Okay.
better. one scholar who looked at this recently is Colin Humphreys in England, and he concluded that it was about 20,000 people total that left Egypt. And I think that's a reasonable figure. And of course, if you use the translation of 1,000 for Aleph, you come up with 600,000 men, which would mean, several million Israelites leaving Egypt. And I think that's an impossibly large number.
Most scholars I've interviewed in my investigation favor much smaller numbers for the Israelites. And I have to admit, this is part of the story that I've struggled with the most. How could so many have survived in the wilderness? So I went to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary to hear from the Hebrew approach. Dr. Jason DeRushi is co-author of A Modern Grammar for Biblical Hebrew. We spoke in the Spurgeon Library. I know that some people would say, well, there were probably 5,000, maybe 10,000 Israelites, maybe 20,000 Israelites.
What people are wanting to do is narrow this language of Aleph in the census list, which are only about the military men, 20 and over, narrow that to mean a military company, a military grouping. But if we do that, we end up with very, very small Israelite population. What's clear in the biblical text is that there has to be enough Israelites in order to make Pharaoh and the rest of Egypt scared. Exodus chapter 1. That they were multiplying in such great ways, thus being faithful to God's promise, and bringing fear to the Egyptian army.
If the Israelite population had grown like it's written, then it would have been a fantastic miracle, and it would have been just what God had promised Abraham, that his descendants would become as numerous as the stars in the sky on their way to inheriting the promised land. This is in line with the Hebrew approach. What I found curious was that I too have come from a large family with 12 tribes like the Israelites. I have fond memories as a child spending summers on my grandparents' farm. Playing with my cousins, I began to realize I was a part of a much bigger family. My Swedish grandmother, Esther, was one of 10 children. She met a Norwegian immigrant, Edward, and they married. They went on to have 12 children, 6 boys and 6 girls, which would eventually grow into 12 family clans. People in the past just had larger families. My grandparents ended up having 46 grandchildren, who've now created several hundred relatives.
Here we go.
If the Israelites multiplied like my family, then I can see how they could easily get to over 600,000 men while in Egypt. There are several places where Moses uses the Hebrew word Aleph that indicate it was operating with the normal meaning of 1,000. For instance, in the book of Exodus, Moses tells about an offering taken at Mount Sinai.
Each man from 20 years old and upward was to contribute a half shekel according to the sanctuary shekel. The rich could not give more, and the poor could not give less. And the number of half shekels collected came to 603,550.
Then there was the census taken at Mount Sinai.
God told Moses, "Take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel by clan, by fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male, head by head." Each tribe listed their numbers, and the total of the 12 tribes was 603,550.
When the numbers for each tribe in the census are translated with Aleph meaning 1,000, they add up as expected. How then do those in the Egyptian approach come up with smaller numbers for this census?
You always have 1,000 figure followed by a number. The word for 1,000 has more than one meaning. In the Bible, it has more than one meaning. If you take those groups, instead of saying 54,400, you would say 54 clans or families totaling 400 people, 62 clans totaling 700 people, and so forth. Then instead of having 603,550, you would have 598 groups totaling 5,550 people.
I could see that if you add up the census numbers using the meaning of clan for Aleph rather than 1,000, it does not match what the Bible references. And totaling up the hundreds column does not add up either. Is the fact that these numbers are adding up perfectly when translating Aleph as 1,000 just a coincidence? You know, a lot of people have a really difficult time that there were millions of people going out. They think, well, how could that many people exist in the wilderness?
Sure, but in even raising that question regarding their existence in the wilderness, it fails to account for the text itself, which says miracles were happening over and over again. Miracles of manna from heaven, water from a rock. God didn't let their sandals wear out.